to the internet. But at the same time as that, and I guess I'm kind of looping back to Hinton's sense in which there are this dual kind of character, we're about to see what people talk about as the next 2 billion, the next 2 billion people who are about to come online, who will be mostly in the developing world, mostly in emerging economies, mostly accessing the internet over mobile networks and not having our kind of ossified legacy of, using desktops and little icons with their floppy disk telling you to save things and all that whole sort of legacy of stuff that we have. And that, I think, is going to be really interesting because in addition to the question of access to technologies, there's this question of design and who's doing the designing, what are the underlying political assumptions of the kinds of designing that's being done. And if you think about the potential for, millions and millions and millions of new users who are coming at these questions of what the internet is for, what we can use it for, from a different perspective to us, I think that opens up the opportunity for us, earlier users of the internet, to kind of sit back and shut up and listen to what the rest of the world is saying about how the tools of the internet can be used. And we did a story recently, actually, on Spark, which was about the adoption of cell phones and smartphones in Burma, also known as Myanmar. And that's a situation where cell phone adoption has gone from being this very, very elite, very fringe activity that about 4% of the population was using, mostly because it costs something like $5,000 to get a SIM card in Burma because of the structure there, to those things being lifted and now it becoming something around the order of 50% of the population having cell phones and increasingly smartphones in a very, very short period of time. And I talked to a couple of people who were designing for smartphone applications in Burma, and they were making this exact point that it's in those situations where people do not have this whole legacy of expectations and assumptions about what the internet is for, that some really interesting openness and creativity is coming about. So I think that's kind of where we are. The one thing that I did want to add, which is a little bit of a sidebar, but I think when we think about where that sense of the global village is going, we can think of the next level as being the Internet of Things, right? Where we're talking about not person-to-person communication over the internet, but machine-to-machine communication over the internet. And we're really thinking about a city, literally a city, or metaphorically a city, which is capable of contributing data about itself. And so I think that too is also an opportunity for resetting a conversation about how our data gets used in a more egalitarian way. There's a researcher named Sandy Pentland out of MIT that, in conjunction with the World Economic Forum, has been talking about a data commons. It's thinking about a way of, it's a different sense of the global village, of having a community of data which is shared globally. And I think I have some thoughts about that, but I'm going to set them aside. So that, I think, is all I think we're just at a very interesting, as tech people say, an inflection point in where the internet is going, that brings up a lot of the similar kinds of dualities that we're trying to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Honor or Paul, if you might open that standing precept and or somebody, if you could, there's a quick note there that we can open the door. Thank you. Well, thank you all very much. Now, you may want to question each other or raise something among the three of you before I stimulate the question from all three of you, and before we throw it open to the general public. Is there anything you want, any three of you want to comment on what's been said so far?
Let me underline something, or some things Nora said, and totally support them on this question of technology being seemingly equalizing, but not necessarily, and creating fault lines. So the first point I'd make, and I should have made this in my opening remarks, is that the cost of access to the internet varies, as she said, considerably. And in Africa, on average, you pay nine times as much as you would here to access the internet. And that's with incomes that are, a tenth ours. So let's not fool ourselves about how ubiquitous the internet is. It doesn't mean it's not probing everywhere in the world, but there is that imbalance. The second imbalance that's I find striking is that if you look at different, and however you look at it, different measures of technological prowess, or where copyrights, patents, journal citations, 40% of that resides in the US, the European Union and Japan count for 25-ish%, and Africa is of less than 1%. So again, yes, technology is all around us, but where is it being produced? Who's using it the most? Where's the potential for it to be used? Huge imbalance there. And the third and final point I'd make, since she mentioned the fourth industrial revolution, is that and again, sort of development economists like me should worry about this and do, is a lot of East Asian success and some of Latin American success was how? It's having their own industrial revolution. They went through a phase where they specialized in making stuff that required cheap, relatively unskilled, but lots and lots of labor. Because that's the way you sort of grow out of that poverty. Now with robotics, that comparative advantage of countries that have lots of people and can throw cheap labor at a problem is kind of being taken away. And whether you have a robot in China or in the US, the cost is the same. With robots, China no longer has an advantage over anyone else. And so doesn't Vietnam, and so doesn't Burma, and so on. So there's a real issue if you're North Africa, if you're Central Asia, if you're the next generation of Asian countries. What's going to create those cheap, unskilled jobs that kept people occupied and moved them up the value chain? And the fourth industrial revolution does not look promising. That doesn't mean the world is sort of, going to become much. I simply don't know, but I would point out, as I think she did, that this is a real issue for our times.
Notwithstanding the growing middle class, right? Notwithstanding what you're saying.
Notwithstanding the currently growing middle class.
Comment, Carol?
I do want to mention something just coming out of what Bonnie was saying, that
Could you speak up a little bit? It's
sure,
really
yeah,
hard to hear
sure.
you.
I'm a low talker. It's a good thing I normally have a
Pretend you're
microphone in
on
front
the air.
of me.
Pretend
It just made me think when you were talking that one of the topics that comes up a lot on Spark is this issue of the filter bubble and the sort of self-reinforcing nature of the algorithms that show us certain types of stories in our Facebook feed, and if you like this, then you'll like this, and how actually, though the internet potentially gives us access to news and information and perspectives from all over the world, in fact, the studies are that we don't actually take advantage of that we mostly stay in our own little tracks, which is, it strikes me as like the really important role for artists in that context, is that they continue to be able to kind of go outside of that and push us outside of our familiar roots and habits, and perhaps that's even more necessary in an age where we have this kind of ubiquity of information.
Bonnie?
Well, I think that's completely true, that thank God for artists, that they're able to communicate these things to us in ways that we're not able to articulate. And I was thinking about the contrast between, of course, and that was partly what the project I was describing was about, where it really made him reconsider seeing all these refugees. It was completely surrounding where he lived, and it was very, very distressing and moving, and it really made him rethink his position as an artist and what are the important issues that he should be dealing with. I think that was quite instrumental, but I also, one thing that